So I was fascinated by the interaction between Bill Clinton and the Black Lives Matter protester recently about the '93 crime bill and its effect on communities of color in the country.
What's the matter? I don't know how you would characterize the gang leaders who got 13-year-old kids hopped up on crack and sent them out onto the street to murder other African-American children. Maybe you thought they were good citizens. She didn't. She didn't. You are defending the people who kill the lives you say matter. Tell the truth.
One wonders if this was a sign of us finally having this long-awaited conversation about race in campaign 2016. Is that what's happening?
I think it should be. I don't think that it is hardly enough, and it's kind of astounding, really, that we have this moment of receptivity. We have this moment where there's this amazing momentum around Black activism, Black Lives Matter, you know, a sort of heightened visibility of Black intellectuals, Ta-Nehisi Coates. We have Black Twitter and social media leading the cultural conversation, and yet where is the issue of race in this campaign, or anybody's campaign?
I do think you're seeing a lot of more sophisticated language being used, and I think, to me, the turning point was this summer at the Netroots conference when, you know, Bernie Sanders and O'Malley were on stage and Black Lives Matter sort of stormed the stage and took that moment. And there have been repeated moments since then where Hillary's been confronted by Black Lives Matter protesters. I think the language, if you listen to the debates and the language, particularly that Hillary's using, structural racism. When have you ever heard that type of language, which is often considered academic and kept among circles of, you know, race scholars and elites, and those of us who have these conversations all the time, we understand what this means. But when you hear a presidential candidate getting up there and saying, we have to undo structural racism, to me, it indicates that these folks have been schooled to a certain extent on what to say about race. Now, how far that's gotten, I don't know. But
I mean, I think what I'm probably excited about is the fact that protesters and public intellectuals have created, through protests, sort of what protest is supposed to do, which is to create this tension, right? So you have a person like Bill Clinton who the statements that he made in Philadelphia would have just flown, you know, 20 years ago. And now they, on their face, seem ridiculous. Now the question of whether or not we'll sort of jump to the next part of then how do we unpack this in a way that doesn't just say Bill Clinton and Hillary Clinton are racist, but what does this say about our democracy? What does this say about our political process? And the ways that politicians are not always necessarily responsive to the people that put them in office. That's the part that we haven't sort of made that leap yet to.
And I'm not sure these candidates were actually prepared for young and brown and smart people to get up and say, hold up, your husband did this. Your history 20 years ago was that, not just to Clinton, but to any of the candidates that are out there.
And do you think that's because of a prevailing assumption among Democrats that
absolutely
they're okay? And
yeah,
it's not really
we've got that
issue?
vote. We're good. We just need to go to Sylvia's and hit all the sort of the typical brown people stops.
And that's not new. I mean, that's not new. Long held belief that Democrats are the hip ones, the ones that are in on it. They get it.
Does that suggest that some of it is actually sincere as opposed to sort of calculated and programmed, like throwing out the word structural racism and maybe not fully understanding everything that means, or walking into an event that has a history one doesn't understand? Does that suggest that there's a genuine effort to connect that's not purely driven by polls? I mean, is this something to grasp onto?
That's I think, the $64,000 question. I mean, I really think clearly both, certainly on the Democratic side, Bernie and Hillary, I'm going to just call them by their first names.
We're all friends here,
have been very deliberate about staffing up, Their digital outreach campaign, Hillary's is Zerlina Maxwell, Bernie Sanders, a press person is a black woman, Simone Sanders, no relation. So they've been very deliberate. That, I think, is calculated, for sure. Do they know and understand what that staffing, what that positioning means for the black women who are in those roles, and for the black people who see them in those roles? No, I don't think so. And that is a function of not understanding or looking at or anticipating the pushback that you were talking about, Tanzina.
So what is the racial dynamic, the racial politics that we see when we talk about Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton?
Hillary's Latino outreach did this campaign, Not My Abuela, or Not Your Abuela, or something like that, and that just got Like people just took to Twitter and were like, hold up, this is no one's abuela. You're not my abuela, you're not her abuela. Like, you know, you can get it right and then you can seem like you're Hispandering, which is a word that this blog, Latino Rebels, came up with a while ago, which is pandering to the Hispanic community, you know, just for the sake of votes. So I think you have to be really careful. You have a very savvy, young, digitally connected, smart audience, and you can't pander because they'll see right through it.
I would say that on the Democratic side that you see them sort of playing two different games based on the voters of color that they're actually trying to reach out to and targeting. Hillary's, since we're using first name, that her game in targeting older voters of color is not getting it wrong, right? So what is it that I absolutely cannot say and do that would completely lose, you know, you all support for me? I think that Bernie, given that his voters tend to be younger, including his voters of color, is trying to get it right. That like there's a different bar, right? So you see him sort of like failing up throughout the his candidacy from the point at Netroots to now, where he's, you know, at some point refusing to answer questions and then taking on the language of social justice, you know, answering questions at the Apollo about reparations and, you know, apologies for slavery. You don't see those same efforts being made on the Clinton camp side as much as you do checking off the boxes, right? So we need to have the rally at Clark Atlanta University. We need to, you know, get the photo op with Al Sharpton, be at Sylvia's. So they're playing a different game based on who they're actually targeting.
It's so interesting, too, because historically speaking, I mean, Bernie Sanders is a civil rights activist, right? And Bill Clinton was given this kind of moniker as the first black president, which I never believed and never felt he was. I actually think Toni Morrison, was she the one who said that?
Yeah, yeah.
And I love my girl Toni so much, but that I did not support at all. But has sort of been given these accolades from whatever source, and then to come out at those young black activists in this way where he just puffed out his chest and wagged his finger and was like, "Look what we did for you. Why aren't you?" You know, I mean, turned on a dime like that was really extraordinary to me.
And that's what I think is falling flat with younger voters in particular. It's the sense that you owe us. And a lot of people are saying, actually, we don't owe you anything. And you look at the policies that were put in place that we were just talking about in the 90s, you know, that affected young black and brown people of color. So there is this sort of sense that this is a legacy candidate. This is someone that should be, you know, they've tried the woman card a lot of times. You're a feminist, you should vote for Hillary. And that there was a huge backlash to that, right? Women are saying, actually, no, being a feminist means I can decide whoever I want to vote for, not necessarily the woman ticket. And so a lot of these old identity politics tropes, I think, are falling really flat with this young audience. In fact, I think you're seeing identity politics more among white voters than you are among voters of color.
And I think that we're also in sort of a movement moment where you see generations sort of kind of moving apart. I am really struck in following this conversation between sort of black millennials as a black millennial and the sort of old guard civil rights groups and figures who are really supporting the Clintons while the Black Lives Matter protesters and activists are really kind of like holding their feet to the fire. And I think that it sort of goes to experience, right? So we were talking about the 90s earlier and how Gen Xers and baby boomers experienced the 90s. So even though there were gains in the black community, let's say small businesses, employment, some income gains, that those are things that did not stay with the next generation. They were sort of short-term policies. But what did stay was mass incarceration. So when I think about, you know, what the Clintons gave my community, you know, the people that I know, my cousins, my friends, I think about the folks locked up in jail. I don't think about the businesses that came and went or the houses that were swept away with the recession, where, you know, my parents might look fondly on that period and say, oh, it'd be great to have them again. You know, none of that means anything to me.
So the Republican Party, we haven't talked about them yet, but they are also part of this process. And have they dealt at all with the question of race in America?
It's often called dog whistle politics, right? This codified language where we're talking about making America great is making America, for a lot of people, making America white.
Right.
It's Nixon. It's Nixon.
Exactly.
And the silent.
We'll make it great again, right?
Again,
So this is
right.
nostalgia. We're going to go back to Opie Cunningham. And But is there a daylight among the Republicans on this stuff, or are they all kind of lockstep in this like coded language? And
I thought, well, he's no longer in the race. I thought Rand Paul was perhaps the most interesting candidate in terms of his attempts to connect with the African American and black voter base. He went to the NAACP. He had some policies that I thought were pretty unique. Obviously, he didn't make it too far. You didn't see identity politics with Marco Rubio or Ted Cruz. These are the first two Latino candidates to have gotten to this level. And identity politics, with the exception of maybe, you know, that little weird interaction where they were just,
Spanish,
you know, who could speak Spanish better, which I was like, I don't even know if that was Spanish, but, and in fact, there have been Pew data shows that you don't have to speak Spanish to be considered Latino, so that was a total moot point. But even within those two candidates, you saw very little identity politics. So I think they realize now, and Trump's, you know, ascent, I think, is underscoring that their base is with largely white men who are, you know, middle-aged white men. And that's what they're going for, and there's hence all the codified language.
I mean, it is interesting that the Republican side does have two Latinos, or did until recently two, still has one, and you know a black candidate in the race until I don't know when Carson dropped out. Did he ever? I'm trying to remember the Ben Carson campaign.
I know.
It was very quiet.
Did he go there at all?
Bless his heart. I mean, no. I feel like that was like some kind of holograph. I mean, I don't even know what that was, Ben Carson's campaign. And Ben Carson, is he a brain surgeon? Is he a brain surgeon talking in non sequitur passages? I mean, I just didn't, and so certainly, I mean, I didn't trust him on the issue. But I also didn't specifically hear from him on the issue.
No, I don't remember that either. I mean, I think that so much of like the dog whistles are sort of built into Republican politics that, and also we were saying earlier how whiteness is sort of invisible in a way that it's hard to name, it's hard to kind of signal to in a way that people get it. So what you see is, again, candidates talking about making America great again. They're talking about things that are identified with whiteness without being explicit about it. And I think that, to your earlier question, that there isn't much difference in the candidates when it comes to that. That the Republican Party is, for, you know, the most part, the party for older white men. And you don't have to name that in the same way that you do when there are so many competing interests on the Democratic side.
Another kind of byproduct of the sort of whiteness being normative is that, and the conversation, you know, people having a limited appetite for how complicated the conversation can become, is that it becomes very binary. You know, there's white people and there's everybody else. And I think there has been some progress at talking about, you know, white America, black America, Latino America, and obviously intersections there. But obviously there are a lot of people who would not claim any of those traditions as theirs. And have we seen any progress at sort of trying to, I don't know, for lack of a better term, diversify the conversation about diversity?
Race as a social construct was built to serve a slave system between blacks and whites. So that is sort of the home page of that kind of, the kind of racism that is in white people's minds, and they are, you know, functioning and operating under that, with that understanding. Now, that said, in terms of moving forward, I mean, I think that we definitely want to be inclusive, but we first have to dismantle the original construct, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, sort of this idea that like America is built on white supremacy and anti-blackness.
So I was talking to Mark Anthony Neal, professor of African American Studies and English at Duke University, about this yesterday, and you know, we're talking about how when Obama was elected, there's this sort of, you know, magical thinking that came along with that, that this was going to herald in an era of post-racial harmony in America. And I think you're hearing that a lot of, Mark and I were talking about how a lot of particularly whites in this country are done. They don't want to have this conversation. It's like, well, we had a black president, we've made some progress, can we let it go, right? Not all, but that was the sort of general consensus, I think, from a lot of folks. And that hasn't happened. In fact, the opposite has happened. And Mark was saying, you know, in fact, the conversation that people didn't want to have they're being forced to have right now. And I think, again, you're seeing that with a lot of younger people who are taking identity and turning it upside down. I mean, they're deciding their gender, how they want to be called, you know, in terms of their racial identity, their ethnic identity, their gender identity, and they want that to be taken pretty seriously.
I wanted to add to that what I'm excited about as more people come into our democracy and into our electoral politics are the ways that people of color are breaking up traditional racial categories, right? So there was a journalist a few weeks ago who shall remain nameless, who wrote an article about Bernie Sanders and his turnout in Hawaii, and was saying that it was mostly a white turnout for Bernie. And what that journalist was doing is they were looking at the data, and they were miscounting Hispanics who who also identify as white as just white, right? And sort of not looking at that, non-Hispanic white category.
Right. I have a lot to say about that.
Yeah. So it's breaking up these preconceived notions. You also have the entire question of, Arab Americans do not have a box on the census.
That's right.
Right. So they have to, pick one or the other, and that's really confusing for our politics, which I think is good because the system needs to be complicated.
I covered this for the New York Times, and the Arab American question, Arab Americans are automatically classified as white. And that there's a historical reason for that. Latinos, on the other hand, are the only group that is asked a racial and ethnic question, right? So it's very confusing to a lot of Latinos who say, well, wait a minute, that could depend on the color of my skin. There are people in my family who may be everything from your skin color to my skin color to your, Latino families look like this, right? So
they may or may not speak Spanish.
That may or may not speak Spanish, that when they engage with the world, if they're darker skinned, everyone assumes that they're African American, and in fact they're not. There are so many layers to Latino identity and culture that get lost in that question, and it stops a lot of people. You look at Caribbean Latinos, for example, the Cubans, Dominicans, and the Puerto Ricans for the most part, who say, wait, I'm all of those things. Right, so should I be checking all of those boxes, or should I just check a box? Can we get a box to just have, Latino or Hispanic as an identity?
I think along with this increasing sort of people taking ownership of how they're identified and the nomenclature around that might be translating too into sort of breaking up assumptions about how different groups are going to vote or how they're going to play on particular issues. I think one of the things that the Trump people latched onto, and I think it was the Nevada primary, was that despite his, one might say, tough talk on immigration, he got a lot of Latino votes. And that's an absurd example. But obviously there are assumptions about how different groups are going to vote. Oh, you look like that, so you are going to not only support this candidate, but you're going to fall down on this side of this issue or not. And I think that's getting shaken up a little bit.
Yeah.
I had a hairdresser the other day who's a Dominican immigrant. And she was talking about how she said, I think the wall is a great idea. And I was sitting there, and her 10-year-old son said, but Mom, that wall means Trump wants to get rid of all of us, not just some of us, right? So there was this back and forth where the mom was like, well, those of us that are here, it's okay, but we really don't want, everyone else sort of coming in. It is not that cut and dried to assume that Latinos, because you're talking about immigration, we're all going to sort of sympathize with that either, right? It's not just the Latino issue. There are immigrants that come from all over the world. It's been framed as just the Latino issue.
So how did each of you approach covering this? Covering the intersection of race and ethnicity and gender and politics? Because, obviously, I don't think anybody here subscribes to the old idea that we're all objective reporters who walk out with a report card and sort of leave our consciences and experiences behind. But obviously this is an issue. These issues, are uniquely personal. We don't walk into a room without, having that. So how do you balance sort of the need to be a reporter and an analyst with being someone who has lived, one way or another, lived this experience to that point in your life?
Choosing to be a journalist is unique to. It's the inevitable direction to go if you're socially conscious and if you are into social justice. And I am a journalist because I am an advocate for social and racial justice, and I am I serve my community as a journalist in that way. But
I think there's also, I want to address the question itself, because I got asked this question a lot when I founded the Race Beat at the Times. I think when you see, not all journalists start out as journalists, right? You've got journalists who have worked in the financial field, who then become business journalists. You have people who are doctors, who then become health journalists. And when we would look at those examples, we say, wow, that person is such an expert in what they do, that it just makes sense for them to be a journalist. But we don't ask them, wow, you worked in Wall Street. Can you be objective covering CEOs of these companies? Or you were a doctor. Can you really be objective dealing with other doctors? But when it comes to race and gender, there's almost like this assumed agenda that journalists of color or women or whoever is covering a sort of social justice beat has to have. And I think that we have to start there and looking at analyzing why we're asking that question and making those assumptions. What I will say is, having done this for a couple of years now, I think the challenges are often inside the newsroom itself. There is a severe lack of diversity in newsrooms, particularly in mainstream media. I've talked about this for quite some time now. And really where I think it gets interesting is when you're seeing the editing process for a lot of your stories. The pitch process has gotten easier, right? The pitch process is not as hard as it was years ago because now everyone's talking about race.
We're having
so everybody wants to have it. Everybody's got a race beat. Everybody, when they killed the race beat, where at my former employer was like, what's going on? But now everybody's got a race beat, right? So it's not that hard to say, hey, I've got a story about black, brown, women, this, that, whatever. The pitching has gotten easier. Where it's trickier is at the editing process. When you're saying, someone doesn't feel comfortable with something or understand something, the majority of the editors that we deal with, I'm sure all of us, are white. And so there's a sort of gut reaction to say, let's just take that out. And in fact, the answer is no, let's understand it. So you, the editor, understand it so it can stay in because that's necessary for context. So that the battles are changing, but they're still necessary.
The editing process and also the awareness process, right? I mean, it goes beyond, I mean, it's such an interesting thing, the idea of objectivity around race and the agenda, the implied agenda, and so on and so forth, and that journalists are meant to be, if objective or if not objective, at least well-read and culturally savvy, right? But how many white editors have you had who, have said, well, who's Daniel Holtzclaw? How do you not know who that is? Because it doesn't matter really what happens to black women.
Who's Ava DuVernay?
Right. And so that, it's absolutely...
What's Black Twitter? I can go on.
Or I've heard of Black Twitter. Can you please explain it to me?
How do you log into Black Twitter?
Yeah, exactly. And so that then becomes...
But is that don't you want them to ask if they don't know?
Well, I mean, I enjoy the curiosity, but I think that, because
so
it's like,
nice. I enjoy the curiosity.
It's a great question, so what I don't like though is when editors, journalists who are otherwise curious people do not do their due diligence to sort of find these things out themselves.
Because that's what we do, right? That's why.
Absolutely. Like I'm reading everything all the time. I'm all over Twitter. I'm tapping into conversations. I don't appreciate having to be the
guide.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. So,
and if I'm going to be the guide, trust what I'm
exactly. I was just
telling
going to say.
If
absolutely.
you're looking to me to guide you, and I'm telling you that is my expertise, trust that I'm not going to lead you wrong because none of my work has shown anything wrong so far. So
not to mention, pay me what you owe me.
Well, that's a whole. Oh my God, we're gonna go there.
Yeah. So let me ask you, but if we have a problem, and I understand your point that the assumption that someone who is not white on the race beat or the ethnicity beat would come with an agenda. Let's turn that around and say, how do we feel about a white person on that beat? I mean, obviously they have their own agenda and background too. Is that something one would be comfortable with?
I think we've had white people on that beat. Maybe it hasn't been called that beat for
sure.
But if we called it that,
I take real issue with that. I think that it goes along the lines of if I'm going to be that person, then you need to let me be that person and let me be the expert. And there's some standing down that has to go on, and there's some deference that has to happen. And that is like the ultimate, kind of outing of white privilege, which is that there is this choice to either defer or not defer, and more often than not, the deference doesn't happen because they choose to not, you know. So it's
because what the deference does is it says that being a person of color, being a woman, being a queer person is important and valuable and adds something, right? That person may not have because they are white, male, straight, cis, and that's a really hard thing to accept.
There's just this assumption that white reporters can handle all types of topics, and they're expected to do so seamlessly and easily. And I'd like to see the same thing, the same privileges granted to reporters of color.
Well, I'll drink to that. Thank you, guys.
Cheers. Thank you.
Cheers. Yay.
So in case it seemed like we were taking a serious topic too seriously, we're going to play a drinking game. I'm going to read quotes by some of the people who are seeking to be the most powerful person in the world, and you have to identify which of the candidates uttered each of these quotes. And if somebody gets it right, everyone else has to drink. If you get it wrong, only you have to drink.
Oh, okay.
You ready? Mm-hmm. All right. First one. When you're white, you don't know what it's like to be living
Bernie
in a
Sanders.
ghetto. Very good. All right. Everyone else.
That was good.
Give it up. Next one. I want to tear down the barriers of systemic racism that
Hillary
are
Clinton.
All right.
She said
No,
systemic.
you don't drink.
She said
She did,
systemic.
yeah.
All right. Well, good. I'll drink to that.
Here. I think the most powerful value in the Hispanic community is the American dream.
Donald Trump.
Rubio.
No, you're all wrong. It's Ted Cruz.
Oh,
You all drink.
man.
Since I knew the answer, I won't.
Ooh.
He said that?
And
When?
he probably meant it too.
Oh boy. Okay.
I'll tell you another story about a place where Black Lives
Bill
Matter.
Clinton.
Very good. Bill Clinton.
Africa.
Wow.
Africa.
Well
That's
done.
the kicker, really.
Wow.
You know there's a new politically correct term for illegal aliens?
Trump.
It's called undocumented Democrats. He's wrong. Anybody else?
Marco Rubio?
Kasich.
Ted Cruz.
Ooh, I was gonna say
Drink up.
Cruz.
Drink up.
I couldn't even keep this pace when I was in college. I mean,
Tiny baby sips.
Last of all,
right,
at the,
yeah.
in the middle of the day. Oh, yeah, yeah. Okay.
Keep the pinky out. Obama's support among hardworking Americans, white Americans, is weakening again.
Trump.
That's a
Bernie
whole
Sanders?
other one.
Hillary.
That's like a repeat of like 2008.
It's a old
Drink.
favorite from 2008.
Ah, okay.
wow, come on now. You,
Sorry.
didn't,
All right, I'll drink two. since I
you need
lied
to
about
drink
that.
on that one.
Yeah, that was unfair.
They're bringing drugs, they're
Trump.
bringing crime, they're rapists, and some, I assume, are good people. Trump it is.
Right.
But let's all
Donald
drink.
J. Trump.
All right.
Cheers, everyone.
Cheers.
Thank
Well,
Cheers.
I'm not drinking to
No.
that.
Yeah, no, I'm not
Oh,
for that.